Here's the story of John McKini, broken down into 60 distinct cinematic scenes. Each scene contains exactly 4 lines of narrative or dialogue and follows the story precisely as it occurred. The jungle of Luzon was thick, with a humid, suffocating silence at 4:47 a.m. Private John McKini lay in his tent, oblivious to the shadows moving through the trees. 100 Japanese soldiers were crawling toward the American outpost at Dingolan Bay. The sharecropper's son from Georgia had only minutes of peace left in his world. At 24 years old, John was a man of few words and a third-grade education. He had spent 2.5 years in the army, surviving New Guinean disease. The Philippine campaign had already claimed 60,000 American casualties in the mud. The Japanese forces refused to surrender, opting instead for suicide charges and dawn raids. Company A of the 123rd Infantry had established this outpost to guard a supply route. The position was vital for the movement of troops and equipment through Tayabas province. 3 Americans manned a light machine gun on the perimeter to keep watch over the dark. McKini had just finished his shift at that gun and stepped away to rest his eyes. He walked the few paces to his tent and collapsed onto his cot with a heavy sigh. His M1 Garand rifle was placed carefully beside him, a habit born of survival. Outside, the jungle was deathly quiet, but the enemy had been watching for days. They had timed the guard rotations and counted every man in the American perimeter. The Japanese assault force consisted of 100 veterans from various shattered units. They moved like ghosts through the undergrowth, carrying rifles, grenades, and sharpened swords. Their objective was brutal and absolute: overrun the camp and kill every American inside. They planned to capture the supplies and turn the American weapons against the survivors. The vanguard of the attack slipped past the outer guard posts without making a sound. Sergeant Fukutaro Mori led the advance element with his katana drawn and ready. His orders were to eliminate the first Americans silently to prevent an early alarm. By the time the main force struck, the perimeter was meant to be already compromised. Mori reached McKini's tent and paused to listen to the steady breathing inside. He gripped his sword with both hands, preparing for a single lethal diagonal slash. One quick strike would end the American's life before he could even reach for a gun. But John McKini was not a typical soldier. He was a hunter trained by the Georgia woods. Growing up in Screven County, John had learned to shoot before he could properly read. His father was a sharecropper, and hunting was the only way the family could eat. By age 12, John could hit a squirrel at 50 yards with a small .22 rifle. He had spent his life in the brush, where a single mistake meant a night of hunger. The Army discovered his illiteracy early, but they also saw his incredible marksmanship. His qualification scores were higher than anything the drill sergeants had ever seen. He moved through the woods differently than the city boys, quieter and more alert. He was a veteran of the Pacific Theater who had survived malaria and the brutal jungle. His fellow soldiers knew him as a quiet man who kept to himself and did his duty. They also knew 2 things. He was the best shot in the company, and he never left his rifle. That M1 Garand was an extension of his arm, oiled and ready for the moment of truth. Sergeant Mori threw open the tent flap. That rifle was within John's immediate reach. The sword came down in the darkness, a silver flash aimed directly at McKini's neck. Sergeant Mori misjudged the distance in the shadows, and the blade struck the side of the head. It severed part of John's right ear, sending a spray of hot blood across the canvas. McKini's eyes snapped open to searing pain, and the silhouette of a man with a raised sword. Mori was already bringing the blade back down for a second, finishing strike at the cot. McKini did not think or hesitate. 24 years of instinct took over his body. His hand found the M1 Garand in the dark, and he swung it upward like a heavy club. The rifle butt caught Mori under the chin with enough force to shatter his jaw instantly. The Japanese sergeant staggered back, but McKini did not give him a chance to recover. He swung the rifle again, the heavy wood connecting with Mori's skull in a sickening crack. Outside the tent, The silence of the jungle was replaced by the sound of sprinting feet. The main assault had begun, and dozens of enemy soldiers were pouring into the camp. McKini grabbed his rifle and stepped out of his tent into the dim pre-dawn light. His ear was bleeding profusely, and a constant ringing filled his wounded head. What he saw through the haze of pain made his blood run cold and his heart race. The machine gun position, just 30 yards away, was being swarmed by the enemy. Muzzle flashes strobed in the darkness, and the air was filled with the screams of the dying. The light crack of Arisaka rifles mixed with the heavy reports of American Garands. The first wave of Japanese soldiers had already reached the sandbagged gun placement. McKini watched as the figures struggled in the shadows for control of the heavy weapon. His mind processed the tactical nightmare in a matter of split seconds and instinct. The machine gun was the anchor of the perimeter and covered the main approach route. If the Japanese captured it and turned it around, they would slaughter the entire company. Every American at Dingolan Bay would die if that gun stayed in enemy hands. McKini ignored his wounds and began to run toward the chaos of the gun pit. The two soldiers who had replaced him were fighting for their lives against the swarm. Private James Hendricks had taken a bayonet to the shoulder and was bleeding out. The third man grabbed Hendricks and dragged him toward the rear to save his life. The retreat saved the wounded man, but it left the machine gun completely undefended. 10 Japanese infantrymen swarmed over the sandbag wall before McKini could reach it. One soldier immediately began fumbling with the gun's traversing mechanism to turn it. The others pointed their rifles outward, waiting to kill any American who tried to counterattack. McKini did not slow down, he did not seek cover, and he did not wait for any backup. He sprinted directly toward the 10 enemy soldiers who now held the vital weapon. The Japanese saw him coming, a single, blood-covered American charging through the dark. 2 soldiers raised their rifles to end his charge, but McKini was faster than they expected. The Georgia hunter shot the first man at 15 yards with mechanical, cold precision. The second man fell at 10 yards as the M1 Garand kicked against John's shoulder. By the time he reached the sandbag wall, he had fired 4 rounds and killed 4 men. He leaped over the side and into the pit, landing among the 6 remaining soldiers. The interior of the gun pit was a cramped space of only 8 feet by 6 feet. 6 enemy soldiers were trapped in that confined area with a man who had nothing to lose. Some tried to swing their long rifles around, while others reached for their bayonets. One was still frantically trying to clear the machine gun to fire it into the camp. McKini kept firing at point-blank range until the internal magazine of his rifle was empty. The next 3 rounds went into 3 Japanese soldiers at a distance of only inches. The 8th man lunged forward with a bayonet aimed directly at McKini's chest. John fired his last round into the man's torso just as the bayonet grazed his uniform. The M1 Garand's bolt locked back with its distinctive metallic and high-pitched ping. 3 Japanese soldiers were still alive in the pit and knew the American was empty. They moved in to finish him, but McKini reversed his grip on the rifle instantly. He swung the heavy weapon like an axe, the walnut stock shattering the first man's temple. He swung again, the rifle but crushing the second soldier's skull as he tried to block. The third soldier lunged with a bayonet, but McKini sidestepped the thrust with ease. He brought the rifle down hard on the back of the man's neck, snapping the vertebrae. In just 30 seconds, 10 Japanese soldiers lay dead in the pit, all killed by 1 man. McKini grabbed for the machine gun, hoping to use it against the waves still coming. His hands found the receiver, but he realized the weapon had been damaged in the fight. The bolt was jammed, the feed tray was bent, and the charging handle would not move. The most important weapon in the perimeter was now nothing more than a heavy hunk of steel. Dawn was starting to lighten the eastern horizon, revealing the true scale of the attack. McKini looked up from the broken gun and saw more Japanese soldiers regrouping. A second wave was forming at the edge of the jungle, preparing for a massive push. He stood alone with an empty rifle, a severed ear, and a dozen bodies at his feet. He reached down and pulled a bandolier of ammunition from one of the dead Japanese. The enemy had looted American .30 caliber rounds from a previous battle. McKini slammed a fresh clip into his Garand, his fingers moving with practiced speed. Beyond the tree line, a Japanese officer shouted orders for the next stage of the assault. John settled into the gun pit among the dead, resting his rifle on the sandbag wall. The second wave emerged from the jungle 60 yards away, 20 men in the first line. They came at a full run, rifles fixed with bayonets, screaming as they charged the pit. McKini put his front sight on the lead soldier and calmly squeezed the trigger. The M1 Garand was designed for rapid fire, and McKini was a master of its rhythm. The first Japanese soldier dropped at 60 yards, followed immediately by the second. John did not think. His body simply remembered the thousands of hours in the woods. Lead the target, squeeze the trigger, acquire the next target, and repeat the cycle. The clip ejected with a ping, and McKini slammed in a fresh one in under 2 seconds. The charging wave had covered 20 yards during the reload, closing the distance fast. Started firing again, cutting down the men who expected to find an empty position. Instead of a captured gun, they found a single man firing with terrifying mechanical precision. 8 rounds reload. 8 rounds reload. The pattern of death continued without pause. Some attackers made it to within 15 yards of the sandbags before McKini dropped them. The Georgia hunter tracked the survivors as they tried to veer left or right for cover. He knew from hunting deer that a moving target was often easier to lead and hit. The second wave finally broke, and the survivors scattered back toward the safety of the trees. McKini counted the new bodies in front of his position. 11 more men were down. It brought his total to 21 kills since the attack had started in the dark, but the Japanese were not finished yet. Their officers were already reorganizing the ranks. A hollow thump echoed from the jungle, the unmistakable sound of enemy knee mortar. The first round exploded 10 yards to his left, spraying dirt and hot shrapnel. McKini flattened himself against the sandbags as the second round landed even closer. The Japanese had realized that charging blindly into his rifle fire was a losing tactic. The third mortar round hit the parapet directly, showering John with wood and debris. The wall partially collapsed, leaving McKini half exposed to the jungle and rifle fire. He knew that if he stayed in the pit, the mortar gunners would eventually find their mark. A grenade landed 3 feet away. John grabbed it and threw it back instantly. The grenade exploded in midair, and the blast wave knocked McKini sideways in the mud. His head was ringing, and his makeshift ear bandage was soaked through with blood. He made a desperate decision. Staying in the collapsed pit meant certain death. He grabbed 2 more bandoliers from the dead and prepared to move into the open. McKini sprinted 15 yards to a shallow depression in the ground as bullets snapped past. He threw himself into the dirt and rolled onto his back to check his surroundings. The Japanese saw him moving and thought he was retreating in fear or desperation. 2 squads emerged from the tree line at a fast walk, moving toward the abandoned pit. McKini let them get to 30 yards before he opened fire from his new, hidden position. The attackers had bunched together while crossing the open ground, a fatal mistake. His first shot dropped the point man, and his second hit the soldier directly behind. He picked them off as they scattered, firing and reloading with the same cold speed. The survivors reached the gun pit only to find the bodies of their fallen comrades. They had expected to find the American there, but he was shooting from a different angle. 3 more fell before they could locate his muzzle flash in the growing morning light. McKini changed his position again, moving 10 yards to his right through the brush. He was doing what he had always done in the Georgia woods: never stay in one place. A deer that hears 1 gunshot freezes, but one that hears 2 from different spots panics. The Japanese were running in circles, unable to pin down the source of the fire. John had been fighting for 18 minutes, and his ammunition was finally running low. He saw movement in the jungle, suggesting the enemy was massing for one final push. He needed more ammunition, and knew the only place to get it was the original gun pit. He waited for a lull in the mortar fire, counted to 3, and sprinted across the gap. Rifle fire erupted from the trees, and a bullet tugged at his sleeve as he ran. He dove the last 5 feet and landed among the bodies he had created earlier that morning. The smell of blood, cordite, and death hit him, but it was a smell he knew well. John moved through the corpses, grabbing every bandolier and loose clip he could find. He stuffed 64 rounds into his pockets and found 3 Japanese grenades on a belt. A Japanese soldier appeared over the sandbag wall, rifle raised to kill the American. McKini shot him through the chest at 2 feet before the man could pull his trigger. John armed one of the captured grenades and threw it toward the concentrated muzzle flashes. He was out of the pit and moving to a new shell crater before the smoke even cleared. The new crater was 3 feet deep, providing enough cover to protect him from direct fire. He counted the bodies between his position and the trees. There were nearly 30 now. The mortar fire had stopped because the Japanese had lost visual contact with their target. He used the brief silence to reload every empty clip he carried with steady, bloody fingers. McKini had enough ammunition for 10 more reloads, roughly 80 rounds of fire. The attack had lasted 23 minutes, and he had already killed 30 soldiers. But the math was still against him. The enemy still had nearly 50 men left to fight. He wondered where the rest of Company A was, but the camp was still in total chaos. The Japanese regrouped at the edge of the jungle, officers studying the American lines. They had lost a third of their force to 1 man and still hadn't broken the perimeter. The enemy commander gestured toward the supply tents, planning a new flanking route. He intended to bypass the killing ground McKini had created to hit the camp's soft side. McKini read the intention instantly and realized he had to move to stop the flank. He climbed out of his crater and ran 40 yards toward the stack of supply crates. He threw himself behind the ammunition boxes just as the first enemy squad emerged. 12 soldiers were moving in a column, heading for a gap between the large tents. McKini opened fire from the shadows, dropping the first 3 men in the column. The others could not locate him in the darkness between the tents and fired blindly. John shot 2 more, and the remaining 7 scattered for whatever cover they could find. He then shifted his aim to the tree line, where 20 more men were beginning to emerge. The Japanese reserve force hesitated at the edge of the jungle, and it cost them dearly. McKini fired into the cluster, reloading and firing until bodies dropped among the trees. 26 minutes into the battle, his confirmed kill count had risen to 35. The enemy commander was baffled. His reports claimed they were facing a massive force. The Japanese began dropping mortar rounds on the supply area to flush the American out. McKini moved north along the perimeter, finding a deep, abandoned foxhole to hide in. The enemy attacked from 2 directions simultaneously to split his attention and fire. John engaged both groups, dropping 2 men from the south and 2 from the northeast. The attack stalled, but the Japanese did not retreat this time. They went to ground. It finally figured out that the fire was coming from a single, lone rifleman. This knowledge changed their tactics, and they began to advance individually and slowly. 1 man would move, while others provided covering fire, closing the distance yard by yard. McKini read the intention instantly and realized he had to move to stop the flank. He climbed out of his crater and ran 40 yards toward the stack of supply crates. He threw himself behind the ammunition boxes just as the first enemy squad emerged. 12 soldiers were moving in a column, heading for a gap between the large tents. McKini opened fire from the shadows, dropping the first 3 men in the column. The others could not locate him in the darkness between the tents and fired blindly. John shot 2 more, and the remaining 7 scattered for whatever cover they could find. He then shifted his aim to the tree line, where 20 more men were beginning to emerge. The Japanese reserve force hesitated at the edge of the jungle, and it cost them dearly. McKini fired into the cluster, reloading and firing until bodies dropped among the trees. 26 minutes into the battle, his confirmed kill count had risen to 35. The enemy commander was baffled. His reports claimed they were facing a massive force. The Japanese began dropping mortar rounds on the supply area to flush the American out. McKini moved north along the perimeter, finding a deep abandoned foxhole to hide in. The enemy attacked from two directions simultaneously to split his attention and fire. John engaged both groups, dropping 2 men from the south and 2 from the northeast. The attack stalled, but the Japanese did not retreat this time. They went to ground. They'd finally figured out that the fire was coming from a single, lone rifleman. This knowledge changed their tactics, and they began to advance individually and slowly. One man would move, while others provided covering fire, closing the distance yard by yard. McKini recognized the tactic. It was the same way a pack of coyotes hunts its prey. It could only watch one threat at a time while the others closed in from the sides. 31 minutes had passed, and the enemy was now within 15 yards of his hole. It had fewer than 30 rounds remaining, and the foxhole felt like a waiting grave. McKini did not wait to be cornered. He burst out of the hole and charged the nearest group. 5 men were behind a fallen palm tree, and they were stunned to see him attacking. He shot the first while running and smashed the third with his rifle butt at the log. He drove the steel butt plate into the 4th man's throat and shot the 5th in the back. The southern group saw him in the open and sprinted toward him with bayonets leveled. McKini turned and fired, dropping 3 men before his M1 Garand pinged empty. 3 more reached him before he could reload, and 1 tackled him around the waist. John went down hard, his rifle flying from his hands into the thick, wet mud. A soldier stomped on his wounded ear, and another raised a bayonet for the killing blow. McKini grabbed the ankle of the man on his head and twisted with all his strength. The soldier fell, and John rolled away as the bayonet thrust buried itself in the dirt. He scrambled to his knees, found his rifle, and swung it in a wide, desperate arc. The rifle butt caught one soldier in the temple and the next in the ribs, breaking bone. The 3rd soldier lunged, but McKini blocked the blade with the barrel of his Garand. He stepped inside the man's reach and delivered a brutal headbutt to the soldier's face. 2 more strikes with the rifle but ended the fight, leaving John standing over them. 33 minutes had passed, and John's hands were slick with his own blood. He looked around the field and saw movement. 2 more soldiers emerging from the trees. His rifle was empty, but he didn't stop. He charged the pair with a guttural scream. He covered the 10 yards and clubbed them both down before they could even react. He remembered the mortar position to the southwest and knew he had to silence it. John found a loaded M1 on a dead American and started moving toward the mortar flash. The 2-man crew scrambled to defend themselves, but McKini was faster and more focused. He shot them both from 45 yards away, finally ending the indirect fire threat. 35 minutes after the first sword strike, John McKini stood alone in the light. The jungle was finally quiet, save for the moans of the wounded and the buzzing flies. His vision was blurring from exhaustion and blood loss, but he remained in control. He walked back toward the perimeter as the first reinforcements finally appeared. The soldiers of Company A stopped in horror at the carnage surrounding Private McKini. They found 40 dead Japanese soldiers in the immediate vicinity of his heroic stand. The investigators eventually confirmed that John had single-handedly saved the outpost. In January 1946, President Truman placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. John McKini returned to Georgia to live a quiet life as a farmer and a hunter. He rarely spoke of the 36 minutes that defined his service and his soul. He died in 1997, a hero who never sought fame, only the safety of his friends. His legacy lives on in the Georgia woods and the highway that bears his name. The platoon sergeant reached the gun pit and stopped, unable to process the sight. Bodies were stacked like cordwood around the sandbags and draped over the logs. He looked at McKini, who was staring blankly at the jungle with his rifle low. The silence that followed the screaming was heavier than the humidity of the Luzon morning. "Are there any more of you?" the sergeant asked, looking for other defenders. McKini simply shook his head and gestured to the bloody bandage on his ear. The sergeant called for a medic to attend to the private's shredded, swollen side. John sat on a crate, his hands finally beginning to shake from the adrenaline crash. The medic worked quickly to clean the wound where Sergeant Maury's blade had struck. McKini didn't flinch as the antiseptic burned the raw, open flesh of his head. He watched the other soldiers move through the grass, checking the enemy for life. The morning sun was fully up now, casting long shadows over the field of the dead. A squad leader began the grim task of counting the fallen enemy soldiers. He moved from the gun pit to the supply tents, marking each location with a notch. The numbers climbed so high that he stopped and asked for a second man to verify. He couldn't believe that one man had held this much ground against so many. The final count in the immediate vicinity of the machine gun was 38 dead. 2 more were found at the mortar position, bringing the confirmed total to 40. Witnesses confirmed that no other Americans had been in that sector during the peak. The ballistic evidence of spent casings matched every position McKini had described. The commanding officer of Company A arrived to survey the scene of the breakthrough. He looked at the broken machine gun and the shattered stock of McKini's rifle. The officer realized that if John had retreated, the entire company would have been lost. He sat down and began writing the initial report for a high-level military commendation. The report moved up to the 123rd Infantry Regiment, where it met immediate skepticism. Officers at headquarters assumed the numbers were inflated by the chaos of combat. Killing 40 men in 36 minutes sounded like a tall tale from a desperate front. They ordered a formal intelligence team to conduct a thorough field investigation. Investigators spent days on the ridge, measuring distances and examining the trajectories. They interviewed the 2 wounded men who had been dragged from the pit early on. They looked at the hand-to-hand injuries on the Japanese and the empty clips in the mud. Every piece of physical evidence pointed to the exact story McKini had told. The intelligence team concluded that the report was not an exaggeration, but a fact. John McKini had indeed fought off a company-sized element with just his rifle and hands. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor was drafted in the early summer of 1945. The sharecropper, who couldn't read, was now the talk of the entire division. While the paperwork moved through Washington, McKini was sent to a recovery hospital. His ear would never be the same, leaving him with a permanent reminder of the sword. He didn't ask for special treatment and wanted to return to his unit as soon as possible. He was a man who did his job and expected nothing in return for his survival. The war in the Pacific finally ended in August, and the world began to celebrate. For John, the end of the shooting meant he could finally think about Georgia. He boarded a transport ship, the Medal of Honor recommendation still pending in the files. He watched the waves and thought about the squirrels in the oaks of Screven County. In January 1946, a telegram arrived at his home. Summoning him to Washington, D.C., the White House was a world away from the dirt floors and cotton fields of his youth. He put on his best uniform, his shoes polished to a mirror shine for the president. He felt out of place among the generals and the polished marble of the Capitol. President Harry Truman stood before him, holding the blue ribbon with the gold star. "I would rather have this medal than be president," Truman told him with a smile. John stood at stiff attention as the highest honor in the land was placed around his neck. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life." Reporters swarmed him afterward, asking for the secret to his incredible survival. McKini gave them the same brief, factual account he had given the sergeant on Luzon. He didn't use big words, and he didn't try to make himself look like a movie hero. To him, it was just a morning where he had to work harder than usual to stay alive. The press compared him to Audie Murphy, the most decorated soldier of the European War. Both were small-town boys who had faced impossible odds and refused to back down. But while Murphy went to Hollywood to play himself, John turned his back on the cameras, took his medal, caught a train south, and disappeared back into the Georgia heat. He returned to the life of a sharecropper, working the land that his father had worked. The medal went into a drawer, wrapped in a cloth to keep the dust away. He didn't wear it to parades, and he didn't use it to get free meals or favors. He wanted to be John the farmer, not John the killer of 40 men. The nightmares started almost immediately, lurking in the shadows of his quiet bedroom. He would wake up drenched in sweat, his hands searching the sheets for a rifle. The smell of the swamp would sometimes trigger a flashback to the rot of Dingolan Bay. In those days, men didn't talk about their trauma. They simply carried it in silence. He married a local girl and began the long process of building a family and a home. He worked in the fields from sunup to sundown, finding peace in the repetitive labor. His children knew their father was a veteran, but they didn't know the full story. He kept the violence of his past far away from the dinner table and the porch. Years turned into decades, and the world slowly forgot about the battle on the ridge. The 33rd Infantry Division's exploits became footnotes in massive history books. New wars in Korea and Vietnam took the headlines and created a new generation of heroes. John watched the news in silence, knowing exactly what those young men were feeling. He worked as a game warden for a time, protecting the woods he had always loved. His legendary marksmanship never faded, though he now only used it for the hunt. He could still track a deer through the thickest brush without making a single sound. The skills that saved him on Luzon were the skills that defined his entire existence. In the 1960s, a few historians began to track down the quiet hero of Screven County. They found a man who was polite but firm about not wanting to revisit the carnage. "I did what I had to do," he would say before moving the conversation to the crops. He didn't see himself as a legend, saw himself as a man who had been lucky. The physical toll of the war began to show as John entered his 60s and 70s. His ear gave him constant trouble, and his joints ached from the old jungle rot. But he never complained, maintaining the same stoic grace he had shown in the army. He was a pillar of his community, respected for his character rather than his medals. In 2007, a book called Phantom Warrior was published, detailing his life in service. The author had spent years digging through the archives to prove the impossible count. It brought the story of the Georgia sharecropper back into the public eye after years. Sadly, John had passed away before he could see the full recognition of his deeds. He died on April 5, 1997, at the age of 76, surrounded by his loved ones. The man who had survived 101 fight passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was buried in the red clay of Georgia, the land he had fought so hard to return to. A small military headstone marked the grave of a man who was larger than life. 20 years after his death, the state of Georgia decided to honor him once more. Legislators realized that a hero of his magnitude deserved a permanent public tribute. They voted unanimously to rename a section of the local highway in his eternal honor. The John R. McKini Medal of Honor Highway became a reality in Screven County. The ceremony was attended by veterans from across the state and the McKini family. Uniformed soldiers stood at attention as the new road signs were finally unveiled. It was a moment of closure for a community that had always known he was special. The highway stretches through the same woods where John had first learned to hunt. Drivers pass those signs every day, most of them unaware of the man behind the name. They don't know about the 36 minutes that changed the course of a campaign. They don't know about the private who fought with a broken rifle and a severed ear. But the story remains etched into the history of the United States Army forever. John McKini was the embodiment of the citizen soldier who rose to the occasion. He didn't have a high school diploma, but he had a heart that wouldn't acknowledge fear. He protected his brothers in arms when they were at their most vulnerable and weak. He asked for nothing from his country except the right to come home and be left alone. 40 men in 36 minutes remains one of the most lopsided victories in history. It is taught in tactical schools as a masterclass in aggressive solo perimeter defense. It serves as a reminder that the individual soldier is still the most lethal force. The Georgia Phantom may be gone, but his spirit is found in every hunter in the woods. We tell this story so that the name John McKini never fades into the mist of time. He was a sharecropper, a hunter, a soldier, and a hero of the highest possible order. Remember the tent, the sword, the man who refused to die on a ridge in Luzon. His life was a testament to the quiet, unbreakable strength of the American spirit.